Rock and roll. Kia ora, everybody. What's up? It is Robett. Welcome to Robett Live, episode 263. I've done some counting. We've done a lot, and we're keeping it going. Politics last week, politics this week, and I thought I'd do a political panel. And I'll tell you why I'm excited, team. I'll tell you why. Because I've interviewed, I know, these fine political weapons that are about to join us, and I'm going to have no understanding of about 98.9% of all the stuff they're going to get into, because they can actually go deep on stuff that I don't really know much about. But I'm going to stand here quietly in the corner and I will happily learn and listen, because I will say, not that I didn't give a shit about politics before, but when you get older and you start realizing you got to pay the old tax, and you start realizing, wait a second, that's kind of more money that I could have for other stuff, and you start thinking about it, then you have kids and you be like, wait a second, my wife's a nurse, they should get paid more, stuff that my children need to get, better education, these roads are shit, that stuff's whack, and all the rest of it. Before you know it, everything you know and touch in your life is some way associated to politics. So I've got a newfound respect for it, and I'm learning more and more. And obviously with the politics, the election last week, there was lots of stuff happening. Clearly I'm not physically on the ground, but it's been really good to watch. So without further ado, we're going to have a political panel. Introducing in first, Mr. Ashley Church, Brad Olsen, and last but not least, Holly Bennett. I actually should have gone the other way, Holly, so I apologize. Ladies first. How are we, team?
Good. Very well. Good to see you all. Was there an election?
So I think I'll start this way. One, Brad, way to just totally copy and try and one-up Ashley's background game and suit and tie. Two, Holly, I like the black. You've clearly got the memo. Happy with that.
Yep.
And
nice.
And then I thought this would be a good, because every time I've talked politics and stuff with you guys before, and it's always very interesting. And so maybe we'll do ladies first. Where are you? What's going on? And in a 1 minute summary, how do you think the week went in politics? And then we can get into a few different topics. But Holly, lead us off, and then followed by Ashley, then Brad. Holly.
Okay, absolutely. Kia ora, everyone. A momentous election result. First time in MMP history that we have a government formed outright. I thought that was spectacular. Definitely a sense of what's happening on the ground in the country, perhaps attributable somewhat to COVID-19, but definitely a sense of that this government now has to govern for a very centrist agenda. Not any radical stuff, not any far-reaching left. And I'm really interested to see what will deliver over the next 3 years.
Great soundbite, Holly. Straight into it. Ashley?
Yeah, so I agree with Holly's summary. Don't necessarily share her enthusiasm. For me, it was the victory of substance over style over substance. But Holly's right. We've got the one good thing for me that's come out of it is that the Greens aren't going to hold the balance of power. We've got a government which is going to recognise, I think, that it has to vote in the centre, as Holly said. That it has to govern in the centre, as Holly said. And the result of that's going to be, I think, not actually a lot's going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a relatively benign environment leading up to the 2023 election.
You got me excited, Ashley. Thanks for that, Brad.
I'm sort of surprised by you guys say, being so energetic about it, because for me it was a pretty boring election. I mean, it went on for a long time, and if anything, we got the result that we'd all been expecting. If anything, though, what surprised me was that we knew that Labor was going to hold up the party vote. I was really surprised at how many electorate seats were flipped. That's people saying that, look, I want a Labor person on the ground to represent me, and that's a big change. The struggle I think for the government moving ahead is going to be, look, there's a lot of talk going on, and talk is cheap, right? We need to get some action going, and the government has struggled with that in the previous term. They couldn't get light rail underway. Kiwi Build absolutely was just abysmal, and the Provincial Growth Fund just didn't go anywhere. So I think this time the focus is on execution, and that's going to be interesting. You don't have necessarily the Greens providing some of those really far-reaching ideas, but you also don't have New Zealand First as a handbrake or as a check. And so Labor's, I think, got a lot of work to do to maintain a cohesive direction.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Brad, you started to quote the failures. I was going to say, don't do that. We've only got an hour.
So if anyone doesn't know, Ashley's a big proponent of, is it the Māori Party? Is that what you're representing out there?
That's me, yeah.
No, I sit in such a funky spot. I think, I've told you my thing before, when I was whānau's from Ngāti Porou, East Coast Gisborne, heavy Māori roots, get that. Grown up in Aranui, Christchurch, heavy labour on the east side with Leon Dalziel and that crew. I then went this pro snowboard world, travel the world, it was all green environment and people. Then I come into business world, and then obviously, can understand from the national sort of side of things. And I've got friends all over the spot. But what was really interesting in this election is I've got different pockets of crews I talk to, and the text banter on the different tones, there was an overarching theme of, if where likability of a human was so disconnected from action on the ground of politics, from all of it, they were saying, she's just so likable and lovely. And I was saying, well, if that's what the people want, isn't that the best thing? So maybe I'll ask this question to sort of lead it off. If we didn't have COVID and those big events, from actual execution, do you think the results would have gone the way it did? If COVID wasn't here, would the same thing have happened? Or do you think it would have flipped? Oh, everyone's shaking. We've got. Okay, please continue. We've got some consensus.
The thing we probably want to focus on there is looking at the polls back before COVID, and they showed a very tight race, and that people were sort of thinking about a change. And particularly, I think from a business point of view, we're already seeing some cracks emerge. Now, those cracks have been blown to smithereens because of COVID. But again, I think from people moving ahead, the other thing that businesses often look at is what they can get out of things, right? They're self-interested. What they could see coming out of this COVID election was continuity. They could see that the ground wouldn't shift. There'd be no real direction change, because I think, as both Ashley and Holly have mentioned, this was a bit of a policy light election. We had a lot of star power, but we didn't have a lot of discussions around what was going to change. And businesses at the moment are very happy to have a stable basis of operations.
Yeah. Holly, do you want to go before me? No, all right, I'll jump in there then. I wrote an article about this back in February based on the landscape as it existed back then, and I was actually predicting at that stage a change of government. And the reason for that was because and it was pre-COVID, based on all of the indicators back then, and based on any sort of basic understanding of how MMP works, this was going to be a one-term government. I don't think there was any doubt of that. Bridges was polling significantly higher as leader of National than Labor by about a 9% percentage point margin. Even the Greens and Labor combined weren't going to be able to get enough support to form a government. It was all looking like it was going National's way, and then COVID hit and the entire political environment changed. So for me, it's all about COVID. It's entirely about COVID. It's entirely about the narrative that Labor managed to develop around COVID, and it's entirely about what happened subsequent to that first outbreak.
And I would definitely have to agree with what Brad said in terms of businesses are inherently self-interested. Absolutely. I run too. And of course, I'm always thinking about what's happening in the bottom line of those businesses and where the money's going and where it needs to go. What we really need to see, as both other panelists have touched on, is a plan now, because the absence of any way out of this COVID crisis, a plan to this point, has not been seen. And now they have an outright majority in Parliament to make things happen. We need to see a plan. Something has to change, and we have to have a pathway forward.
Because it feels like there's her brand Jacinta globally has won every single marketing award that any human could ever potentially have for the world, right? It's insane. But then at the moment, I think what you're saying is there's no, it's like marketing sales. Great brand, and now you've got to go and execute and go to actually sell and do some stuff. So do you think she's going to be more pressured to actually execute now because she's got the brand, she's back in there, and do you think that's going to play a role for this next bit?
Just on that marketing thing, Robert, if it was about branding, if it was about image, the Kardashians would be running the US. And I don't mean to be rude, but it's that.
Well, Kanye's going for president. He's half there.
So good point. Maybe that's going to work. But going forward, I think in Holly's intro, she was right. It's not about what she necessarily instinctively wants to do. It's about what she's going to recognise is going to be required over the next 3 years in order to maintain a third term. And the reason for that, if you look at the way that the National vote went, so let's be fair, National blew this election for themselves. So they weren't going to win it, but there's a good chance they could have got into the mid-30s if they'd actually run a better campaign. The reason that didn't is because of all the shenanigans that went on with leadership changes, the leaking, and all the things that happened prior to the lead up to the election. But if you look at what happened to the National vote, it's pretty clear what happened. Obviously, the core stayed with them. But I think a fairly significant chunk of it went in one of two directions. It either went to ACT, people who voted for ACT because they recognised that ACT was going to get in, so they might as well put their vote there because they were disgruntled with National. But there was a fairly large cohort, I think, in that last probably 7 days who saw the prospect of the Greens having a stranglehold over Labour and being in a position where they actually exercise the balance of power, who said, no way do we want that, and they voted Labour. So if Ardern is smart, she's going to recognise that, and in order to hold those people, she's going to have to govern more in the centre.
I think, I mean, the other challenge, though, from a, I guess, the direction from here point of view, is that we've had a good response. Now, crisis management is critical, has been critical the last few months, and the government's done well. They stood things up quickly. They supported businesses. They supported households. All of that was fantastic. But we don't, like Holly said, and I think this is actually the most critical point, we don't actually have a firm plan going forward. If we look at the resurgence outbreak in Auckland, Ministry of Health was ready to go. They had contact tracing, it was all fine. The Finance Minister, the Treasury, Ministry of Social Development, they said, hey, it's going to take us about 5 days to get another wage subsidy ready. Just hold on, will you? And so that sort of said to me that we were ready for a bit of a reaction, but we didn't have those longer term plans in place. And I guess I say that because you look at the borders, they're not going to be open anytime soon. That's 5% of the economy gone. You also look at, we are in a recession. We're not going to have as much money either from overseas or from local households. That's a bit more coming back. And so the question becomes, okay, what does the government do to stimulate that activity? Because that short-term stimulus is good, but you can't pay out 14, 15, 16 billion on a wage subsidy every year. That's just not sustainable. And the challenge is that at the moment, the focus is on education. Now, that's broadly good, but it's too focused, I think, on the group of people that I'm not going to say don't need the help, but is missing in a sense. So at the moment, we've got shovel-ready projects, $3 billion worth of stimulus, and a lot of focus on getting people re-educated in the likes of construction and similar. But we also know that Māori, young people and women are most affected in terms of the job losses so far. Now, if I go up to Northland, my home area of Taitokoro, they will tell me that if you want to put a young person in, say a young woman into a training course, they can go and do an electrician's course for free, or they can try and become a nurse and pay $7,000 a year. And I think we really need to recognise that when we sort of approach these issues, when we think of this recovery plan, we actually focus on the people, because too often I think we just focus on the overarching stuff, and that's not going to get us forward. That's not going to put us in a good position. It's going to keep a lot of New Zealanders in a very tough place.
Mate, I can't wait in 6 years when you try to run for some seat or some shit. I thought you were saying from my hometown of like Ponsonby with your pocket beer and shit. I think it's great. Honestly, you're on fire. I love it. So on that, I think it's interesting. I'll ask, you talk about with national stuffing up. ACT made that huge pop. And I don't know, I've talked to Holly about this. I don't know much about it. But is it because his social game was so epic and for like 6 weeks, or was it for a whole bunch of other reasons? Please please enlighten me.
It's an illusion. It's almost, there's a little bit of it that's based on, I think, a sort of an admiration for David Seymour, which I kind of get, the whole Dancing with the Stars thing. But a big chunk of it, I think, is disgruntled national voters who are looking for somewhere to put their vote. And for that reason, and this is going to sound really pessimistic, and Holly might disagree with me, I don't think it can hold up in 2023. I think most of it will go home.
Oh, yeah, I do agree with that. But we've got 3 years in between that time to sort of see what happens. So
yeah.
Renee, there's an assumption that national is better for business. Well, that all depends what business you're in. Any plan going forward will be interesting because it won't necessarily align with the values of NAT voters. I
don't know that that assumption actually exists, to be honest. I think that if you look back over the last 30 years, Helen Clark, certainly the Longy government, they were also very good for business. So I think I think that's probably a little bit of an assumption.
The challenge,
take that, Renee.
the challenge this year, I think, for businesses is going to be that, although that I said earlier that businesses like a bit of continuity, they like that good planning. There's also going to be another increase, substantial increase to the minimum wage on the 1st of April next year. Now, I mean, that's been pretty well signalled, but I don't think we've ever had such a massive rise in the minimum wage at a time when we're losing, we've got 70,000 Kiwis out of work since the start of this crisis. And I think it is going to be challenging for bottom lines. It is going to be challenging for people trying to rehire. And so that's a struggle we've got to focus on. But the other point, and Holly, I'll be interested in this because I feel like you work a bit closer with people, whereas I work a bit closer with numbers, if you will. But my sort of feeling around the popularity and the social media stuff is that although that's true, New Zealand has this real fascination with can I have a beer with them sort of mentality. You know, you could go and have a beer with John Key. You'd have a beer with Jacinda Ardern. I mean, she helped some bloke in the Kuru Club find a bottle opener when she was there. You know, it was the sort of thing where it was just a lot more personable. I don't know if that's strictly true or as true anymore, but for a lot of people, they are looking at who do I trust enough to lead the country, and therefore I've got to feel a bit more of a relation to them.
Yeah, sure. But what I would say is that, you know, having a relationship with somebody doesn't necessarily equate to good policy, good spending of taxpayers' money, and then moving our country forward. So what you're saying is 100% correct. But as I keep saying to a lot of people, that's not what I'm looking for. It's irrelevant to me. I don't have to like you as long as you're good at your job, and I want to see that.
But Holly, how typical are you? Because I agree with, I absolutely agree with you. But I think Brad's right. I think a really large chunk of the electorate did exactly that. Who aren't necessarily informed about what makes for a good leader or what they should be looking for in policy.
Likability, 100%.
Yeah, and they look at her and they say, I like her, I'll vote for her.
She likes whiskey, she's in.
Hey, listen, incidentally, just coming back to the issue about the wage subsidy, that's a really interesting one because I'm really conflicted on that because on the one hand, one of the key roles of a government should actually be to improve a lot of its people, and if raising your wages are going to do that, then you know, that's fantastic. On the other hand, that's actually going to be paid for by the private sector at possibly the worst time in the last 15 or 20 years in terms of yet another imposition put on them.
Do you mean the wage subsidy or do you mean
no,
the
sorry, I'm
wage
talking about
increase?
the minimum wage, sorry.
Oh,
from April.
okay.
So businesses are going to have to pay for that. So I get it. I understand why you would want to do it, and it's actually an aspect of their policy I agree with, but hell of a bad time to actually put it on businesses right now.
Oh, and even to continue, like kick on with the 1 April increase when we were in lockdown, which meant that some businesses could make $0. I mean, it's all very well to sit in our Rosie's situation where I could continue to keep making money because I can take my laptop and my phone anywhere and I can work. But there were some businesses that they were told you cannot open, $0 for you. But hey, here's a minimum wage increase.
It comes down to this old-fashioned word, Holly. It comes down to lack of wisdom. It's just there doesn't appear to be wisdom in the policy settings that these guys are implementing.
I was going to ask a question. Oh, sorry, Brad, you want to go? Go for it.
No.
I was just going to say, Brad, you talked about with the borders being shut, 5% of GDP is out the fucking door. When you've only got a local people that are there with its own thing, how do you think they're going to best try and stimulate to make that back? Because I think, was it Holly saying last week when they talked about the tech thing, was it that Jacinda had said a soundbite of, I don't think we can do it through servers sitting in a room or something. There was like some soundbite that came out. How do you think they're going to do it? Or what do you think it's a big gap.
That's the challenging thing, right? Is that, you know, it is going to be a long, slow road, and that's why our forecasts are a little bit longer in the tooth. You know, when we were talking to the retail banks, for example, and the likes of the Treasury early on this crisis, all of them thought you'd have unemployment that would rocket up, but then would fall back down within a year or two. We've always maintained the view that we were going to see unemployment that won't go quite as high, but it will remain at a higher level, you know, probably above 6% for at least sort of 2 to 3 years. And that's because once you get people out of a job, you're exactly right. You go, okay, where do we put these workers? Well, there's not that many jobs going for a period. And a lot of these sort of silver bullet areas, if you will, are not going to be particularly strong. I mean, we keep talking about tech, and it doesn't matter where we are, if we're in New Zealand, if we're up in, you know, each town across the country, everyone tells me that there are tech jobs and they're really strong. I've never seen that, you know, actually starting to come through in the numbers or suddenly seeing data hubs pop up here, there, and everywhere. So I don't think we can't take that silver bullet approach. The challenge is going to be, how do we actually get those businesses hiring? That's the big one. How do you actually instill a bit of confidence at a time when businesses are looking out there and going, hell, there's not really any good news. The globe's a bit stuffed. We're a bit stuffed. You know, it's tough. And so I think the challenge for government is, well, put your money where your mouth is. If you're going to go out and procure, you're going to go out and spend some money as the government, and they're spending billions, then find some Kiwi, you know, businesses. Go and have a talk to some of those smaller entities and get some money flowing, because the more you do that, the more activity you can get out the door, the more workers you're employing. So I think part of it is sort of saying, look, government sort of steps up with the cash it has. On the other hand, I think we've got to get a bit smarter with how we develop jobs and similar, because we're not going to see tourism bounce back quite so similarly. I think we've got to try and find more of what we talk about, the weightless economy. How can we do more zeros, if you will, or pay sources or similar, where we can develop some stuff. Businesses need some good digital technology to keep them operating, especially when we're working from home and similar. That does have opportunity, but it's not a click your fingers, we've all solved the problem sort of solution. It's going to take time.
There's some really interesting realignments taking place in the economy, which are either directly or indirectly a result of COVID. So, for example, and you won't see the full effects of this for another couple of years, but remote working. So people that perhaps previously were located in an office who have found, hey, I can work from home, I can be productive. Employers who are saying, hey, that's actually okay, that works for me. The impact of that over the next 2 or 3 years is that when leases expire, you'll see differences in the footprint that businesses actually require, and so you'll see that'll have an impact on the commercial property market. But there's a whole range of stuff. I'm talking to people, for example, in the tech sector, innovators and entrepreneurs who are saying best time we've ever had. There's an opportunity for us to develop. So there's this kind of haves and have-nots taking place in the economy at the moment. There's some really exciting success stories, I think, which will come out of this and will emerge out of it as almost a better country than we were prior to COVID. But then the flip side of that, if you go to a cafe or a restaurant anywhere around the country, they'll tell you that they're struggling. So there's this very strange juxtaposition taking place between, on the one hand, some stuff that's proving to be hugely successful and people who are saying this has been a fantastic time, and a whole other section of society saying this is killing me, my business is going to go under. And I don't think we're going to know what that's going to look like for another year or so.
On that, Ash, I was just going to say here in San Fran, exactly to your point around the commercial thing has happened. As soon as it hit July, and all those big tech companies said none of the workers need to come back to the office until July 2021. Wow. That's an entire year done. In 1 week, there was a massive exodus out of the city, and all of the suburbs, like the East Bay and stuff where we're at, all the house prices shot up. You can't actually really even get a house. The exodus out of New York's been absolutely massive too, because they're doing the same thing. All those big hedge fund managers that were running it all pissed off down to Florida with no state tax and taking all the jobs and stuff with them as well. But the interesting bit on that is then what happens to all the, I went to the city 3 weeks ago, maybe. I had just for a couple of hours, and it's pretty much dead. Entire skyscrapers, zero, nothing. The difference with that is it's going to be like that for the next year, and as all their leases go, they're basically going to or longer, 100% definitely longer. But in New Zealand, it's been different because I guess the two shorter little lockdowns, they got through. I guess it's 1 or 2 months lockdown instead of an entire year or so. So I'm intrigued to see how the commercial markets vary.
You're right, it was shorter, but what happened after the lockdown ended was lots of businesses said to their employees, if you want to stay home and continue working, you can. So although you can go back into commercial premises now, lots of people are still working from home, and that's been the legacy of that initial lockdown.
And to be clear, we're seeing that coming through in the numbers. If you look at consumer spending in Wellington City, Christchurch City, and Hamilton City, all of them are performing worse than the likes of Waipa, outside of Hamilton, Selwyn outside of Christchurch, and just the entirety of the Wellington region. Porirua, Kapiti, the Hutt, Wairarapa, all of those guys are performing better. So people have definitely changed. And I think the shift that you've seen as well, though, and the big challenge is that's going to suck a lot of air out of our more metro areas, and that's where a lot of your shopping and entertainment happens. But more of an issue, I think, is that what does that mean for housing going forward? Because we know it's already damn expensive. But, look, I went through the 4.5 weeks of lockdown zooming around on my ironing board. I don't have a desk at home. And so I think for a lot of people, there's a challenge there over, what are we looking for in a house now? Because it's no longer just a bed and a kitchen, if you will. It's got to have a working space. It's got to have the ability to lock the kids in a different part while you go on your important call. I think what
it's called the basement, Brad.
I'm just thinking too, Brad, you're probably going to trigger a huge increase in sales of ironing boards as a result of
that. Yeah, I was going to say, did you literally do all of your things on an ironing board?
Do you iron while you're doing it?
He's got board shorts on.
The great thing with ironing boards is that they're adjustable, so it's like a standing desk almost. But that's the style change that we're going to see.
Brad, on that point, what's happened in the city to that exact point is in the last couple of years, a bunch of people have been swapping out their, converting all the garages into an additional bedrooms, and they've been using just ride sharing services, and then the value of the house is going up bank because it's going from a 2 to 3 bedroom in the city, which you can't build around. So that was already happening pre-COVID, just in terms of being able to use transportation and not have a car. After that, you're exactly right. It's been interesting to see where the dollars are actually shifting and going. It's kind of moving out of the cities into it. And then I'm imagining the only play they could potentially do if it stays like that for a while is convert commercial to resi, right? And redo a bunch of apartments. I don't know.
That's already to some degree been happening in places like Auckland. So there's a sort of a well-established trend which happens every sort of 10 or 12 years in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch, where you get a big tranche of new commercial buildings. And so each monkey falls off the bed and moves up the chain a little bit. And so the stuff at the bottom tends to either get refurbished or turned into residential. That's been a long-established tradition for probably 30 years.
Yeah, it's a funky one. What surprised you? What was the one thing that surprised you the most out of this last election? Like, who's the biggest loser?
I know.
Harley, you go.
Yeah.
Go.
Multi party is back in Parliament.
Did that surprise you?
Yeah.
It didn't surprise me.
Because fundamentally it came down to one seat, right? And the MP that holds that seat, like the incumbent, has not been doing a bad job for the Waiariki region. So then the question has to become, why and which did the voters decide to move towards Māori Party and away from Labour? And, when that sort of goes against the electoral vote trends that we're seeing across the country. So I was very, very interested to see that happen and, a Māori Party MP back in Parliament.
So the only surprise for me, that's interesting. The only surprise for me was the outright majority. I didn't think that would happen.
I think
Sorry. Go, Brad.
Oh, the surprise for me, it was not a surprise in the sense that, I knew there'd be a lot of new MPs, don't get me wrong, but I heard something the other day that something like 40 out of 120 MPs in the next parliament are brand new. And I think that's going to be quite a change. You've got a third of them complete newbies. The ACT Party's got 9 complete new people in it. Labour's got, people that are crawling out of the woodwork in a sense that they never knew about. And look, National's lost a lot of its sort of former talent. And the challenge and the surprise that I think that there is in store for New Zealand is how effective are they at decision makers? Now, I don't think they'll be bad, but it will take a little while for them to get going into the future. But the other question is Labour did struggle with talent in the last term. They had sort of 5 or 6 real key ministers. You saw there with Chris Hipkins being given everything, Megan Woods being given everything else. What sort of talent can Jacinda Ardern bring into the ministry inside cabinet? And what does she do with that while, there's a lot of people you've got to corral there. And so that's all right for the first wee bit. But if the polls start to turn, if people do sort of shift their expectations, there's a lot of, possible issue points that the Prime Minister might also have to deal with. So just sort of sounding a word of caution that there's a lot of very green MPs, not Green Party, but green experience.
You say that if the tide turns, though, it's going to turn. That you can't. I don't fundamentally think that they're going to stay at 49% favourability throughout a 3-year term. That's just not going to happen. Then I think what we'll see is what you're saying will happen. It will rear its head quite early on in the 3-year term.
We've been here before too. We were here in 1990 with the National Caucus after the trouncing of the Longy government, which was massive. It was I think the biggest caucus of that stage we'd had in history of new MPs. We had it again in 2002 with Alan Clark's government after Bill English's National Party got trounced. So we have these periods of complete refreshing, and it's interesting because it's a bit like looking back on All Black kickers. We sort of think that the last one we had was the best we're ever going to have, and then there's a better one. And so what tends to happen is as these caucuses develop within 3 or 6 years, you start to find that there's some superstars in them, and the parties replenish themselves and things go on. So I'm not concerned about that. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And I agree with Holly that this is a moment in time, and this is probably as good as it's ever going to get for Labour. It's downhill from here. The question's about whether they can sustain a 3rd term or whether it'll be all over at the end of this one.
I was just going to say, Ash, you're bringing up 1990. I remember the 3 of us others on the panel were like about 3 years old, so we don't know what you're talking about. But I'm stoked you were there.
A correction, Robett.
You're not born yet.
No,
you weren't born yet, Holly.
Brad wasn't born, and I was born in 1990. Great year.
I need to go and have basis of that. So
like you jumping into guys, if we just take it back to 1990, and I'm just sitting there, I was like, yo, I was watching like Sesame Street.
Mind you, so was I.
No, but I think, but the lesson, Ash, is these are cycles. This is a momentum. I think you're exactly right. If it's at 49 now, it will be downhill from here. But to what point if they can sustain it? Right. That's the tested and true. Let's talk about Uncle Winnie, old mate from up north.
Yeah.
Is he done, or you think he's going to be like he's going to run it back? Like how
two
go.
schools of thought. So there's one school of thought which I don't agree with, which says Winston is irrepressible and he'll be back, and it doesn't matter how old he is. He's Methuselah, and he'll be back in 2023 and have another crack. I don't think he will. I just think he's too old. I think he's past it. And I think this is it, basically. And Winston Peters is New Zealand first. There is no New Zealand first without Peters. There may well be a group of MPs who try and compete as New Zealand first at the next election. They won't have a hope in hell of actually getting anywhere near 5%. So for me, it's all over. It's the end of an era.
Well, I think all you've got to look at some of the factors, right? He's from the north. He couldn't win Northern, neither could Shane Jones. They put forward $3 billion, and a lot of it went into Northern. That didn't get them anywhere close. New Zealand has an aging population, which is normally a great New Zealand first stronghold, and that vote collapsed this time. I mean, I don't see where these votes come from. I don't see what New Zealand first offers to people that they go, hell yeah, I'm going to back that because I'll get something good out of it. Because they got $3 billion last time and they didn't even budge. I mean, if you can't throw $3 billion in front of people and get the votes, I don't think there's any amount of money that will work.
Yeah, quite right. Holly, I'm going to be fascinated on your view on this.
Well, I mean, people seem to forget that John Key knocked Winston out of Parliament, and I think it was in 17 or 14, whenever it was, I don't know. So he's been knocked out of Parliament before.
Was it 08?
Oh, was it 08? I don't know.
I thought that was when Bridges came in. Didn't Bridges?
She was 12.
Anyway.
So he's been knocked out of Parliament before, and then
he was a lot younger, Holly. He was much younger.
But that's my whole point. Is there the capacity to then ride out another 3 years to then put it in a campaign in 3 years' time? And how old will he be then in 2023?
So here's to pick up on Robert's theme. I'm 56 and I'm feeling pretty old now. So what's Winnie? He's
78, isn't he?
Oh yeah, I can't even imagine what that would be like.
So
he might have
81. That's 81 that we're looking at having. And I don't see it happening. I just don't see it. Just by natural biological traits, I don't see it happening.
I agree.
Well, you saw that right in terms of how he spoke on the night. Now, in previous times, whether or not he was in a strong position or not, he was fiery. He fired up. He gave everyone what they wanted. It was clear that he was still battling, and I found that speech that he gave on election night. He did say wait and see, sure, but he made it. It was a short speech. It was relatively clear where the votes had fallen, and I think given all of the work that he's done, it was a bit of a signal, not the final sort of hurrah, but just a bit of a signal that hey, maybe things are coming to a natural conclusion. Let's go out on high. We've done a lot of great work. We've got some enduring legacies. Perhaps there isn't as much of a path forward, and so let's go on and relax. Let's do a bit more fishing. Let's enjoy what life has got to offer.
I think make no mistakes. You're going to see him. He will be an ambassador, or he will be a special consul or something. He will appear somewhere again in a leadership role somewhere on the international landscape for this country. So
having said that though, Holly, how old's Biden? Is he like in his 80s?
I don't know. Yeah,
he's 70s. They're both in the 70s. 77, I think.
So I don't know if that's a precedent, but and incidentally, what you didn't ask us, Robert, I'm actually not sad to see the back of him. I'm not sad to see the back of Peters. I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think he's negative on the political. He's been entertaining, but I don't think he's been productive.
Well, I'll tell you a story, Ashley. I was once at the RSA up in Dargaville, and I watched Uncle Winnie on Anzac Day walk in, and that dude ran shit. Like, he walked through like he was like on a... I've never seen a dude... Like, I've seen... you see famous people and these celebs and shit, and like, I've seen fame, but you haven't seen Dargaville fame with when he rolls through the RSA.
Wow. You'd want that on your tombstone, wouldn't you?
It was impressive. I'm not gonna say it was genuinely impressive. Like it was like the hot girl walked in, everyone's like, "Oh, yo, check it out." It was like, Gwyneth talking to Steve's like, "Hey, look, it's Winston."
Oh,
I don't know if
really creepy, by the way.
we've been described as a hot girl.
No. The hot girl, yeah.
You know what I mean. So I want to talk about the next bit with, if it's only down from here. How do you think this plays out? If it's a majority, they do from the whole time. So how does it play? Are they going to try and play nice with others? Is it just like stuff that this is what we're going to do? Is it going to be more dictatorship? Obviously, he's saying in the center. Like, how do you think this next 3 years plays out?
Oh, it's got to be centrist. It's got to be centrist. I don't think they've got any choice unless they're stupid, and that's possible. It's got to be much more centrist policy. Incidentally, and I know this is true in housing, and it might be true in some other areas of policy. I think for the two of those the 3 years of their first term, they thought they were going to lose the following election, so they pushed through a heap of policy. If you look at housing, they brought in the 5-year extension to the Bright Line test, changes to the Residential Tenancies Act, the Healthy Homes legislation, ring fencing of tax losses. They did all of that in a hurry because they wanted to get it done before the election. I think there's not. If you look at some of those portfolio areas now, there's actually not a lot more that they'll feel that they need to do. So it'll be a centrist.
I think what we're going to see moving forward with this government and the majority is that they are going to have to play to the centre, but they are going to keep trying to make friends. But make no mistake, any concessions that another party gets, that's what Labor is willing to offer them. Everyone is going to get the bare minimum crumbs because Labor doesn't have to play nice. They will because it is advantageous to them. But, anything the Greens get, anything the Māori Party gets, that is exactly what Labor is willing to give them because there is no bargaining position. There's no power in those negotiations. And so I think we do have to realise that there is sort of a straight line down the middle. There's a bit of variation to either side, but Labor is calling the shots. Make no mistake about that.
My biggest interest in what will happen and how this will play out is what's going to happen with the Deputy Prime Ministership. Now, I don't know about anybody else here on the panel, but I was extremely disappointed in what came out of the Deputy Prime Minister-elect's mouth on election night, just before the Prime Minister-elect came out. And I think that we should touch on that. Well, for example, I was watching News Hub and they did a very graceful thing and turned it off. But we had a potential Deputy Prime Minister referring to parliamentarian colleagues' mental health issues, bringing up issues of race on a time where they had a momentous win. And I thought, is this really what kind of attitude we're getting from somebody who's... Are
you saying it wasn't gracious enough?
It was appalling, is what it was. That's my adjective to describe it.
I've heard about it. I didn't see it. It was pretty bad, obviously.
It was.
Is this the rhyme poem thing that
the limerick? Yes, and I think it's important. I think it's important that we talk about it because to let something like that just gloss by, then we're actually ignoring the fact that those words were said on national TV in a way by somebody who was deputy.
Holly, are we assuming that he'll actually be the deputy because she'll do a reallocation of her cabinet and her portfolios in the next couple of weeks? And it might be Grant Robertson. Who knows?
Oh, absolutely. But that's what I'm hoping to see because I think that in this day and age, to go out and say something like that, especially as someone who is touted as a Māori leader, I was very disappointed that came out of that waha. Like I was like, what are we doing?
Who said it?
Calvin
Davis.
Got it. Yeah, no, well, you can't lead with kindness and then have old mate coming up giving people shit about mental health. It's like, he's gassed. Next.
That's the challenge though, right? Is that, look, I completely agree with you, Holly. I listened to parts of it and I thought, wow, this is... if there's one way that you lose goodwill, it's by saying, that sort of stuff. But it goes to a wider question around judgment, right? And the way that that Davis operates. You look at how he's worked in Parliament, and the times when he has had to stand in for the Prime Minister, he's had to have every other minister whisper in his ear the answers. He hasn't been able to sort of do some of that by himself. But at the same time, there's been a lot of conversation as well around that it would be seen as a slight on sort of the Māori caucus and on the direction of Māori, in terms of leadership by removing the person who is in higher status there. And
but look, he's not the chair of the Māori caucus. Currently, they have the co-chair of the Māori caucus outside cabinet. Here's a great thing to do. Put the them inside cabinet. Like, do you know what I mean? There's things that you
Completely.
can do to change the narrative. But what I'm saying is, somebody who is proud of being Māori, I was very disappointed to even talk about the fact that the leader of the National Party's partner is Samoan, so that means Talofa. Why are we talking about this? Who cares? It was so off tone, and for what happened on the evening, which should have been a celebration of the fact.
Holly Ardern was very careful in her language when she was asked that. She said that the Deputy Prime Minister will be from the Labour Party. She didn't say it would be Davis. So
That's good to know.
The other thing that I'll focus on is, and Ashley and Holly will know this well, we saw throughout lockdown and other periods that there were two ministers, there were two people that fronted up with Dr. Ashley Bloomfield throughout this entire crisis. It was the Prime Minister and it was Grant Robertson. That this is a health crisis first and foremost. Health Minister was literally riding his bike down in Dunedin. We've had a massive increase in how many people are on the dole. Social Welfare Minister, don't know where they were. It was Grant and Jacinda who were running the show, and I think that speaks volumes around who the leadership is. And in a sense that if the Prime Minister is unable to operate, if she's out doing something else, that is where the Deputy PM steps in. And at the moment, regardless of who gets the title, I think it's clear who the second runner, the inside right-hand man is, and it's not Calvin Davis.
Yeah, I agree.
Mate, just soundbite after soundbite there, Brad. You just flip and just wrap that one up on a bow. Jeez. Have you had media training along with your ironing shirts? What are you doing there, Calvin?
Well, but do you want to know, in all honesty, I had an awful stutter as a kid when I was 3. And so, like, from there to here, it's been quite a wild journey, I'm not going to lie.
Mate, to matching pocket squares and socks, you're on fire, mate. I mess with that.
A nice tie.
Yeah. I want to talk about weed. You reckon it's going to go through?
No.
Oh, what?
Not even.
Wait a second. Wait. My cousin messaged me. Well, is it done?
No.
Well, I think
just in the interest of transparency, I voted no and no on the referendum questions. So obviously I've got a bias on it, but the euthanasia will go through at about 75% support would be my pick, and the and the cannabis will be 35 to 37% in favour, the rest against.
Oh, jumping on that. Anyone else?
I reckon it'll be a little bit closer. I reckon euthanasia will get across the line 60-40, but I reckon cannabis will lose 45 to 55 against, roughly.
Why?
I think the big challenge here is that there's a few issues. The first one is there was no strong campaign behind it. No one really fronted up with a strong "yes, let's do it" campaign.
Nando Tanchos, he's coming back.
I don't know if that's true, Brad. Like, was inundated with digital marketing and TV ads on it. I thought it was everywhere.
Oh yeah, but there was no strong leadership. There were a lot of groups and bits and pieces.
There wasn't a person. You're right in that.
Yeah, but whereas you did have at least a bit of a stronger view, coming through, in my view, from the no. The other thing that I'd highlight is that the polling we saw beforehand showed that it wasn't the sort of thing that had a majority to start with. It wasn't all that close, and so I think for a lot of people, they did. There is a fear across a lot of New Zealand around the sort of the law and order element. And the other challenge is that actually this was a non-binding referendum. We don't know what the outcome was going to be. To be honest, Labor could go and do it tomorrow if they really wanted to, because there was no direction either way. There was no bill that was passed. There was a lot of conjecture. And so I think from a lot of people, they went, well, I'm not comfortable enough to make that change yet without having some of these discussions out. The mere fact that the government themselves wasn't prepared to release their economic findings on weed before the election, and that the Prime Minister has been hell-bent in saying, I'm not going to make any calls on what my stance is, highlights to me that there's just not enough confidence in the result, where there was with euthanasia.
Holly, what do you think as a young woman?
Well, I'll do exactly what you did, Ashley, and I'll do full transparency on how I voted. I voted no for weed and yes for end of life choice. But what I would say is that Brad touched on a really interesting point. The government has the mandate or the ability to put some legislation in the House now and usurp what is basically public will, and they could bring this in, ASAP if it was a priority for them. So that's going to be one of the really interesting things for me, is to see whether or not they decide that they're going to do something like this versus what public response has said, which I do think it's not going to come out favourable towards legalising.
What's your pick on the votes? Which way do you think the votes will go?
I don't know. I'm terrible at that stuff.
The bro Victor Vito, awesome insights for what's potentially ahead. Thanks to Brett and everyone on the panel. Shot Victor. He's currently housed up in France next to a winery with wifey and Groms, just with a wine and a big straw. That's what he's up to. Shot Victor.
So sorry, Victor.
Yeah. What?
Oui. I wouldn't have. I thought that was a done deal. I was just like, well, obviously in America, I guess I'm in California too. The stance on the old marriage boo boo is very lax, if you know what I'm saying. And I was like, wait a second. Well, of course New Zealand's going to, like, everyone, like, my mate's a cop. He smokes weed. Everyone I know, like, what? And I'm very surprised that it's a no go.
Yeah.
I'm extremely surprised.
Incidentally, I don't think California is a sound bubble of the US either. We're probably more comfortable with Kentucky or Idaho or somewhere that's perhaps a bit more conservative in its views.
No, that's meth, mate. That's meth over there. Don't worry about that. No, but what has been interesting is Colorado, when they did it in the whole legalized thing, the tax money they've been bringing in is crazy.
Wow.
Absolutely insane. And like big corporates, big tobaccos coming into it. It's huge. And obviously in New Zealand, there's been a couple of these little sort of these marijuana sort of hemp startup, health-based type things. I guess what, do they just go into pause mode now? Like, well, what's the play?
No, because there's a difference between medicinal, which you can use and you can access currently, and you can use that, and that is a good thing because it does provide like a health benefit to a lot of people who need it in regards to whatever ailments that they're having and their doctor prescribes it for them. They don't have to push pause. They keep going. That is
you should have the campaign. Listen to you.
Yeah, Holly. Hey, so can you do CBD pills in New Zealand? Is CBD legal?
I don't know.
Don't even know what it is.
Yeah.
Like CBD oils.
I think you can get like an exemption or something for those sort of products. It is a sort of thing. We've got to do more work to get that regime sort of fully put in place. But at the moment, I think from a New Zealander point of view, there's a sort of feeling that, look, we've got a lot of drug issues in the country. Now, I'm not saying that we go down the slippery slope argument path of saying, weed leads to meth, because I'm pretty sure the studies highlight that it doesn't. But
no, it leads to nachos and cookies, mate, on the couch.
Yeah. People, I think, are worried about what the sort of wider and more pervasive use of it will do. We know that when weed is legalized, that people do use it more, and that's come out of some of the Colorado studies. It does generally say that young people use it less, but we haven't yet had that conversation as well, which I think needed to probably happen around what would weed in being legal in New Zealand mean. How would that work in the workplace? How would we deal with it in terms of drug driving? All those other challenges, because there is a difference here between using weed just recreationally, sitting at home having a bit, and then going out and doing other activities. We didn't have enough of that conversation. I don't think we ever really engaged in the debate at all. Euthanasia, and this is the separate point, right? Euthanasia went through Parliament. We had months and months and months of debate. We had leaders talking about it. Weed was completely separate from that. We had the Greens talking about it. Chloe Swarbrick did a great job to try and raise that profile, but we didn't have a proper engagement on it, whereas euthanasia did. And the other point I'll highlight, though, is that we had sort of three broad conscience issues in the last Parliament. You had, abortion, which was changed within Parliament. We didn't have to go out to a referenda, but we did for the likes of weed, and we did for euthanasia. And I guess the challenge moving forward is that how much do we actually consider that referendums are the right way to go? Because if we're going to leave all of these nitty-gritty issues to the people, then why the hell do we have a parliament? What are they there for? We elect them, we pay them a good amount of money to get the right information to make a well-informed decision based on evidence, but also based on people's views. I think if they abdicate that responsibility too much by going out to referenda, especially with ill thought out or not fully considered policies, then that actually is at the detriment of our ability to make good decisions to move forward.
Brad, you'll never get that balance right, because if you have a parliament or a government that decides it's going to make decisions on behalf of the people, then people will complain that they weren't consulted. If they consult, then as you say, there'll be those who say they're abdicating their responsibility to make a decision. I think for me, it's if it's a conscience issue or it's an issue of belief, then it should absolutely be put to the people to make that decision, and that should be binding. Anything else, probably the government should actually exercise leadership. But moral leadership, that term always concerns me, because morals very much are a subjective thing, and they depend on who's in power and where they stand ideologically.
Couldn't you argue that everything's a matter of belief, though? because there's a lot of the things that the government's done, especially in
cool.
response to COVID, that I don't, as a business owner, they're inherently beneficial for me, but I don't necessarily agree with them because my belief is that it's a misuse of taxpayers' dollars.
Well, in that case, just do what the Swiss do, I think, and just basically dispense with Parliament and do everything by plebiscites. So,
Okay.
might work.
I want to jump back into the euthanasia thing for a second. We had John Tamahiri on the show 2 weeks ago, and he was fully off it. And it was interesting. I'd never thought of the angle, and he brought up, I think we'd maybe have talked about it after, I think, Holly, after we talked to him, was he said, well, if the average life expectancy of Māori is already 7 years, then Pākehā, does that just become a kill switch for a culture? And I was like, I get the angle, but also I've known people in certain situations for it, and I would have voted yes 100% for it, and it's kind of cool to see that you think that's going to go through, because I think that's going to change a lot of people's lives in some pretty unique circumstances as well, which they didn't have the rights before, obviously.
Ashley, you should talk on this, given that you have fundamental disagreement.
Yeah,
go for it.
Oh, mine's
I don't know.
Mine's a faith-based thing, so I have an issue. Yeah, so I have an issue with a decision made either by the individual or by the state around the taking of life. I also have a concern that there's a slippery slope, that at the moment it's based on individual decision. Yeah, at the moment it's based on individual decision, but in 20 years' time, is it people that are born that have defects or that don't fit our social perception of what society should be like? And we say, oh, that won't happen. Of course it will happen. Of course it will happen. That precedent's been set in a range of other things over the last 30 or 40 years. So I guess my worry is, where does this lead over time? But look, I absolutely recognise, Robert, I'm in a minority on that, and I've accepted that.
No, but it's a different angle on it. But go there, Dee, but you say like some, yes, but it's a slippery slope, because then some within some other individual circumstances may literally have their lives ended unfairly, unjustly.
Well, when do you get into, and this is a really emotive term, but how far do you go before it becomes eugenics? How far do you go in this debate before it becomes about society deciding what constitutes a worthwhile member of society and what doesn't?
Cool.
I think
just point out. Oh, okay, you go.
No, you go, Holly.
I was going to say, I'll just point out there's only one person on this call that can carry a human life.
Which one? Robert, congratulations.
The challenge, I think, is I understand where Ashley's coming from, and I think that you say you're in the minority, but I think that there's a lot of people that do hold that view, and I think we do have to take it seriously. My position is that I think we've all done transparency here. I voted yes to euthanasia and no to weed. My thinking around that is, look, at the moment, we have a very, very tight prescription. You have to be in the last 6 months of life. That's not that you've got a mental health issue or that you're in a great deal of pain. It's that your life, by medical expectation, is likely to end in the next 6 months, next 180 days. And moreover, that there are checks and balances that are in there. And I guess that I have a little bit more confidence in New Zealanders that when we start to have a debate over whether we should go away from 6 months, that we won't go down to the willy-nilly angle of, you just want to kill yourself. And I think we do have to keep those ones a little bit more divorced. This is a relatively tight medical area. It has to have good double processes with at least 2 doctors. It is time limited. It provides that you cannot just go through it because of mental health issues and similar. So I think for the minute we've had enough checks and balances put in, but secondly, we've had that long-standing debate over the last year or so with our elected members, with the experts, with the community over what we think are the key issues. And I don't think we're actually veering down that path yet. And I think it would take a very strong shift in New Zealanders' viewpoints to move towards that position, is what I would like to think.
It's a tough one, when there's one rule for all, but then every person's situation is different. And that's, I can definitely see, but I can definitely see the other side too. And even speaking to John with his bit, I got his angle. I was like, okay, I understand that, but it's obviously a bigger, complex thing. What are you most concerned about in this next term, next 3 years? What's the biggest concern for New Zealand as a whole, brand New Zealand to the world, for the next 3 years?
Lack of action, lack of a plan, falling further and further behind the other nations in the OECD.
I am extremely worried about more people losing their jobs and them not having a pathway towards getting re-employed and looking after themselves, looking after their whānau, and what that might mean for, like, you know, ongoing benefit dependency.
Yeah, I think sort of similar there. My one is rising inequality. At the moment, we've got a lot of haves and a lot of have-nots. People are losing jobs. They're often in lower skilled areas. They're young people. They're Māori. They're women. At the same time, we've got a housing market that is just rapidly growing, and Holly and I are probably, you know, in a very tough position to ever get into the housing market, and so are our peers. Now, that's not going away. That's actually getting worse. And if we don't see basically, I think, look, government has abdicated its responsibilities when it comes to inequality a bit. If they don't make some action very swiftly this term, we may well never be able to claw that back.
Well, I would just say that, and like, there's a great commentator on One Roof who talks about the 10% deposit and how that helps fundamentally people in our age bracket get into the housing market. And we have seen a boom in first home buyers. And so I would say that I would just tell that commentator, I can't remember his name, I think it starts with A, might be Ashley, just to keep going and banging that drum, because I think that what we have seen in a pandemic is actually, wow, now that the restrictions have lifted, people of our age can actually scrape together 10%. We can't get 20, but we can get 10, and let us get on the housing market, because that's actually what's happening.
I mean, you know, and this is, you're going to disagree with this, Brad. I think we are currently in the most benign environment for first-time buyers. Let's just turn that off. The most, that's Winston. The most, the most benign environment for first-time buyers that we've been in for 20 years. We've got the Reserve Bank's dropped the LVRs. The banks are now starting to exercise discretion when it comes to the size of the deposit. Getting back to a more practical situation where the party lending the money is actually making the decision. It costs less to service a mortgage now on a property on the median house price, on the median household income, than it did back in the 80s. And yes, it's difficult to compete with property investors. Yes, house prices are going up, and that's difficult. That's always been true. None of that's new. The only thing that's changed is that we've got lower interest rates, and it's actually easier to get onto that ladder. And instead of listening to the prophets of doom, young people should be getting in there, persevering, and getting that first property. Because if they do that and they ignore the nonsense, they'll get a house.
What about if I'm at Pack and Save on $12 an hour?
Oh, I agree. There's always going to be.
Well, no, hold on. That's illegal. If you're at Pack and Save on $12 an hour, then we have an employment problem.
So no, well, hey, Holly, I don't know what my first job was. $5.50 an hour sweeping floors underneath cheapskates with a flipping broom and a torch. It was super shit. We've come a long way since.
It's a fair question, and the answer is there's always going to be a section of society that rents for one reason or another, and that proportion's been pretty consistent at about 60-40 for a very long period of time. I'm referring to those people who could get a house but are being put off because they're reading this nonsense that's telling them that it's too hard and that they're victims. And that really, really upsets me, because it's simply not true.
I think that's fair. I think we've also got to realise, though, that, I mean, the amount of money, I don't disagree with you, actually, that, look, if you're on the housing, I think the way we probably need to phrase that a little bit differently is that it's not easy to get on the housing ladder, it's easy to stay on the housing ladder. Once you get over that deposit threshold, sure, it's cheap as chips, if you will, to continue on. But, man, who the hell's got a spare 120, 160K in their back pocket?
So the LVRs have gone, Brad, and the banks are now finally starting to actually exercise discretion. So you'll see those deposit requirements come down. I think Holly's right. If it carries on at this rate, you'll get down to 10%. That's achievable. It's certainly achievable in the regions, and it's potentially achievable in some parts of Auckland. So that whole equation's being turned on its head.
So you go, Brad.
The one thing that concerns me, I don't disagree. The thing that concerns me is talking to people out in the market. The question, if you will, that mortgage brokers and similar are asking has changed from have you asked mum and dad for money to how much have you got from them? And I think that the challenge that we have moving ahead is that there isn't going to be that same generational wealth distribution in terms of passing things on over time. And so, look, I'm not saying that, you know, every young person is completely stuffed from the housing market, but it's quite clear that the numbers are showing us that the gap is widening. And if we don't start to address that soon, you are going to lock that in. That's what we've seen in economics time and time again, is that there is a critical point, a critical tipping point where you do not have that coming through. The best indicator of that, Robert, is the social housing wait list. That was running at about 4,000 on average for the 3 years to mid-2016. It's now gone to nearly 20,000. You can't tell me that it's easy enough to get on the housing ladder, because it's quite easily proven that it's not. Now, I don't disagree, actually, that, you know, there are bits that are becoming easier, but there's a hell of a lot of people that are not going to be in that same position. And I think we have to recognize that we are leaving them out.
I mean, we could spend a whole hour on this, but the social housing debate's a completely different debate. The social housing debate's around people who are in a completely different set of circumstances. And it's also worth mentioning this. I could go on the social housing register. Holly could go on the social housing register. It's an opt-in register. It's not based on any means testing whatsoever. So it shouldn't surprise us within the term of a Labor government with Green support that register would have increased, because that perception of entitlement has been increased. For me, it's about what's happening within the part of the market, that 60% of the market where people can purchase, and we should be doing everything we can now to get people into a home, not trying to create new obstacles by saying there's a problem in the market, you're a victim, don't even try. That's the bit that's irritating me. We should be doing everything we can as a nation, saying how can we get people into a home, because that's the most important and the most valuable thing you can do for anybody.
I was just thinking. No. It's, I get it. I mean, Ashley, what would you know about property in New Zealand?
Well,
anyway,
there is that.
No, but there's something quite interesting that we're talking about commercial prices with COVID. In a weird way, maybe it might actually help home ownership, because if COVID's making virtual working and remote working more accessible and easier, there'd be more bosses that are open to have staff going elsewhere, right? Is that?
Yes. And
do you think that may happen? You go.
I do. And what will happen, and in fact this has already started to happen even pre-COVID, is over the next 20 years or so, you'll see a drift to the regions, because the days of having to be co-located in the CBD and having to commute through your Auckland, Wellington or Christchurch suburb are disappearing. You'll be able to be in Hawke's Bay, you'll be able to be in Taranaki, you'll be able to be in Manawatu or Otago and still work for the same employer. That balance has changed. That's a really positive thing. It will have an impact on house prices in the region.
Yeah, but that same house that would be 1.5 in Auckland, imagine now if you get the same job externally, it could be 500, 600, 700, whatever potentially elsewhere, right? So that could open it up.
Although probably going up a bit more quickly as a result of this, but yes.
Yes, which is exactly what's happening in the Bay Area, is everyone's going out of the city. But interestingly enough, say down in Silicon Valley, the whole mini ecosystem of bars and restaurants and small stores, gone burgers. That whole bigger thing outside of it because of it. This has been
the suburbs, Robert. Sorry, I imagine if you go out into the suburbs in San Fran, the opposite's the case. You're seeing a proliferation of new hospitality institutes. Yeah, so the balance changes.
Yeah, and then yes, there is, and those that are actually crushing the most have outdoor. Those that have outdoor stuff are on fire, and they're doubled, but everyone else inside is pretty much shut down, all the malls and everything. So it's going to be like that for the while, because as soon as that call was made from big tech that any staff can be anywhere in the world and piss off, it doesn't matter, the whole game changed, because all of a sudden everyone's like, wait a second, now I've got my same salary and I can go to flipping Oregon and I'm buying, whatever. So that's been interesting. Team, this has been great. I'm not going to say I had reservations or hesitations about this panel, because obviously we have some good banters, but I definitely know where some of you stand on certain things. And I was hoping we'd be able to navigate through with a bit of humor and jest, but also with a bit of mic dropping when needed, which I was very happy with. Well done, team. Good job. Good Kiwiness. But mate, if we go back to that 1990 thing, I tell you what, man, I remember those days. Those were great. Holly, Ash, Brad, this has been really cool. Appreciate the time. We need to do this again. This was cool. I like it. I learned a lot.
Good stuff, Rob.
Just,
appreciate the opportunity.
Brad, just quickly, do you have like a little side panel with heaps of numbers that we just reading out and you had them as bullet points? Do you actually know that stuff?
All up here, mate. All up here.
Love your work, Tim. All right, I'll see you guys soon.
Ka kite.
Gotcha.
See you, team. What a good one. Good session, team. Bloody great. Very lucky. Ashley Church, Brad Olsen, and Holly Bennett joining us today for Political Panel. Learned a lot. very hard thing with politics because you've got a whole 360 thing involving every part of community and society, and there's all these different layers. But it was great that you can have different thoughts. And obviously, with the election last week, we will see how things are going to go for the next little bit. So hopefully you learned a little bit. I did too. Not a politician. No one pays me to do any of this. I genuinely enjoy learning, and I appreciate the time for everyone to be able to jump on and help out. So big ups and thanks to our massive guests that came on spent their time with us. Big thanks to you for listening and learning. This episode has been brought to you by brightfire.co.nz and switch.stream. Have a good day, team. I'll see you all.